All right, I'm going to suggest we go ahead then and get underway. I'm going to say good day because I think we might have people from various time zones from around the world on the screen. My name's Norm Taylor. It's my pleasure to serve as the moderator and one of the panelists in this discussion session that we've set up for today. Welcome to LEPH, Pennsylvania. They tell me it's always sunny in Pennsylvania. I've heard that line, but I have no idea. I know it's sunny where I am. I'm coming to you from just outside Toronto. And I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves and where they're from in just a moment. We want to thank you for joining us here at LEPH. This is the third LEPH conference for me, and I know for some of my team here, they'd be the fourth or fifth. When we left Edinburgh, we kind of thought we'd all be seeing each other in Philadelphia. Nice that we're able to do this. My congratulations to the LEPH organizers for a tremendous re-navigation towards a totally virtual conference. So we're going to try to use this medium to the best of our ability. I'm going to start by just putting up a couple of very simple images that I want to use to set the tone and let you know what we're going to be talking about. Hopefully you can see that slide. By the way, there's a hands up function on the Zoom. Don't hesitate anytime to put your hand up and we'll stop. Some of you will know that the folks behind the global law enforcement public health movement have worked with the Springer Publishing Company to produce a what's called the Springer Collection on law enforcement and public health. We were very pleased to be invited to contribute a chapter. And it actually didn't take us very long, the four of us, to decide what that chapter should be about. And that's what today's session is going to focus on. And we're happy to not just give you an overview of the chapter, but really dive into some of the themes and issues that we've raised in it. The chapter is called Improving Community Outcomes and Social Equity Through Leveraged Police Leadership. Long and fancy title. It must have been early in COVID when I was on my back deck and came up with that title. It actually does describe what we're addressing. And today what we want to have is an open conversation with you. I'm joined by three very distinguished individuals. Each of these people could be a chapter on their own. And I say that in all honesty. And it's been my distinct pleasure to work with the three gentlemen on the panel over 20 years in some cases, and all very well known in policing in Canada, policing internationally, and most importantly, all connected to what we call the community safety and well-being movement, which is somewhat synonymous with law enforcement, public health, collaborative public health approaches that we've been working together on for at least a decade. A quick overview of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to do some introductions in a moment. We're going to talk about changing patterns in policing leadership. What inspired us in this chapter is not to do just a chapter on leadership. We know there's a lot of great literature on leadership, and we support all of those existing theories on what constitutes good leadership and what constitutes good leadership in policing. But very specifically, we wanted to focus on what's different, and particularly what's different in a collaborative space. And any of you that are at this conference will certainly understand that term. More and more, we're seeing multidisciplinary approaches, and we know that after 2020, more than ever, we need to work together to make this stuff happen. And we've been breaking down silos, all of us, for quite some time. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to invite, as I introduce our panelists, I'm going to invite them to offer their own observations on some of these changing patterns. And then we're going to invite you, as the folks online, to contribute your observations and experiences, so we can talk a little bit about how is leadership different, is it different, and in what ways. Ultimately, we focus our chapter on three distinctive characteristics that we think have emerged over the last decade, and we're going to apply those by using some case studies. And I'll talk more about those case studies in a few minutes. And ultimately, we may end our session by all of us collectively looking ahead and talking about global leadership development. We open our chapter, by the way, by reflecting on the number of times, including very recently, where we've had conversations amongst ourselves about who are the next, who are the up and comers, who are the ones you would bet on in terms of leading policing within a collaborative framework. And in our chapter, we assert that it's almost always a short list, and it still is. And that's something we need to do something about. If we're going to have the kind of police leadership and LEPH leadership that can deal with collaborative multidisciplinary approaches, we think there are some unique challenges. On that note, let me stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to begin to introduce your panelists for today. I'm going to start with Cal Corley. Cal, I'll let you introduce yourself, but you've built a global reputation for your work in police leadership development, many years, many roles in Canada and around the world. And I know you're very familiar with the wide body of literature on leadership, specifically that aimed for police executives. Cal's often sending me a clip or an article or whatever, and I know he's very well aware. But what I want to know, Cal, as you introduce yourselves, what's different? What's different in your view, so much that it inspired you to co-author this chapter at this time? I mean, isn't there enough theory out there already? Can you maybe give people a quick sense of yourself, your background, and your brief answers to those questions to get us started? Go.
Sure. Thanks, Norm. Welcome again, everybody. My name is Cal Corley. I'm the executive director of a small nonprofit, the Community Safety Knowledge Alliance, or CSKA. We support governments, police agencies, and others in the development, implementation, and evaluation or assessment of new approaches to community safety. I've been in this role now for just coming on 6 years. Prior to that, I spent a full career, over 35 years, with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, retiring in 2014. Range of roles, my last 6 years, I headed up the Canadian Police College, was the RCMP's senior envoy to Mexico and the Americas, supporting capacity building in the hemisphere, and co-leading with others some work around the economics of policing. So what's different this time, I think, Norm, it's all about windows of opportunity. The last time there was a window of opportunity that approached the magnitude of this one was really post-global financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And unfortunately, parochial forces towards the status quo really prevailed then. And while there were some modest changes in policing and such, and this is all part of an evolution, I think the present situation is considerably different from that. Two factors that I think are most important. One is the broad-based calls for social change that are intensifying expectations on the police and the broader community safety and well-being system to improve transparency, responsiveness, and accountability, while bringing much greater attention to long-standing issues of social inclusion and social justice. So that's kind of environmental scan issue number one. The second trend is one that's looming, and this is the extraordinary levels of stimulus and other pandemic-related spending that governments at all levels and in all Western countries, at least, have been doing, and that's going to bring just absolutely unparalleled pressure on all service providers, including the police, to look at reducing costs. The only way that I can see that we're going to reduce costs is continuing down this pathway of at that intersection of law enforcement and public health, by restructuring and reimagining how some of this is organized and delivered. It's a rare platform to fundamentally rethink all of this, and I think we're there. Your second question around, isn't there enough theory already? Lots of theory, lots of conceptual frameworks in that. What we're talking about here is really taking a lot of those existing ones and mobilizing and implementing them. And that's the challenge that lies before us, and looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
So I heard language in there. I heard you use the word reimagine. I heard you use the word rethink. I didn't hear you use the word defund. And yet you appear to be talking about the scarcity of funds. Quick comment on that?
Well, the defunding language is one that's troubled me from the outset. And I think most people around the table would have multiple interpretations. I think for myself, it's simply a platform to reimagine how policing, how community safety is organized, structured, and delivered. And we're seeing a lot of examples across North America, across Western Europe, and elsewhere that are leading the way in that regard. But now's the time. This is the window.
Good answer, and I agree with you. And let's focus on that rethink, reimagine, glass half full, because there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that regard. Dale, my good friend Dale, I've had the pleasure of working very closely with Dale for over a decade. Dale, you've been a police officer through 3 decades. People on the screen may know that, but they might not know that you've also been a sports leader, both on and off the ice. You've been an entrepreneurial coach and mentor. You've been a small city chief, a senior provincial government official, and now a major city chief. Most who know you would say that leadership is in your blood. So tell me and tell us anything I might have missed in that quick bio. And just as importantly, can you tell us in a few minutes what that word means to you today, this word leadership? How is it different? And if
Yeah,
it is, in your view, from what it meant 20 years ago? Dale?
that's well. First of all, Norm, thank you for those kind words. I'm not sure I know that guy, but at the end of the day, I think some of the things that before we talk about what's changed, I think what's the same, and you and I and others on the call have often talked about this, is we always known that leadership is a learned skill, and we always know that leadership is not a role, it's a responsibility. So if you focus on those things that haven't changed, what's allowed us to pivot and actually drive meaningful collective change? For me, it's what you've talked about. It's those vast different experiences, being able to see things through multiple lenses. For instance, not only the things you mentioned, but co-chairing StatsCan for 4.5 years, federal, provincial, territorial deputy, chaired that for all the deputies across the country, senior role in government to look at transformational change. I've been pretty fortunate and pretty lucky to have served in some of those roles. I think what's really changed now from what it was 20 years ago, as you mentioned, is what we actually can bring to the table in knowledge. The data's there. Like you said, we don't need another study. Those things have been done too much. You mentioned defund to Cal earlier. That's never worked. Why would we try it again? I mean, everybody says move money from police to social services. Well, having worked in government, I already know it's funded at a 7-to-1 ratio, social services to police. What's really missing in this particular environment that I think allows us to drive the change is the ability to look collectively at collective impact, collective outcomes. To me, that's why LEPH. LEPH, for those of you don't really understand it or just getting involved, I think I've been involved for 5 years now. To me, this is where the puck is going if you live in Canada. It's where, if you're Michael Jordan in basketball in the US, it's actually the ability to leverage others. And when you start to talk about that, what's different? We better understand what drives police work now. And there's two distinct functions. There's the crime, which, those, as StatsCan would tell you, repeat offenders are basically those that are most likely to come and recontact the justice system. And then there's the whole social system, which is the majority of calls for service. Those are two fundamental differences, and we have to operate in those space with balance. That's where law enforcement and public health, I think, actually start to shape that particular course and let us do different. For me, what it means is we need diverse experiences, but as police leaders, we need to use our voice of influence as much, if not more, than our voice of authority. Authority is not going to solve this. It's the ability to get others to look at this thing differently and realize the only thing that we haven't changed is structure. So somebody asked me years ago, or not years ago, actually months ago, Chief, if you were king for a day, what would you change? I said, I'd take police out of the justice system, and I'd take public health out of the health system, and I'd put the front end of the system in the same ministry or the same structure and differentiate between the front and the back. Because we always have our authority to push something in the criminal justice system, but what we don't have is the collective authority to make that first call a difference maker. So I think it's that collective understanding of leadership, and based on the data and what we have available to us now, to know better is to do better. And I think we're positioned to lead a lot of great things. And as Cal mentioned, and as you mentioned, we must leverage the timing. Never before have we went through a downturn of the economy, COVID-19, and George Floyd. And if we don't leverage this opportunity to create the change, we'll never get it done. So I think of anything right now, the most important piece is to leverage and capitalize on the timing of the market.
Excellent. Thanks. Well, you've already introduced some themes that I want to dive deeper into as we go along, and there's certainly some of the things we talk about in our chapter. in particular, this difference of authority versus other forms of leadership. I want to come back to that as well. Great start. I'm really proud to call this next gentleman one of my closest friends. Matt and I first teamed up together. And a shout out to one of our guests, Paul Pedersen, was part of that when we did some work for the Ontario Association of Chiefs of Police about 20 years ago. Matt, when we first started working together 20 years ago, you were one of the first of what I would call at the time an intellectual police chief, police executive at that time. And now today, among your many roles, you're a distinguished fellow. You actually have that title. I mean, I think we're all, a lot of people here, but you actually get that title, a distinguished fellow at the Monk School of Global Affairs. That's a pretty long journey from street cop in Kitchener. Now, as you flesh out that introduction a little bit in your own words, tell us briefly what drew you in that particular career direction and has continued to drive your thinking and still does, as I still see in the broad range of work you're contributing to in the LAPH community and in our work with the Journal of Community Safety and Wellbeing. Go ahead, buddy.
Thanks, Norm. I think both on the intellectual comment and the distinguished fellow Paul Pedersen fell off his chair probably. But I mean, I certainly wouldn't use that that intellectual part to describe me, but maybe curiosity. I mean, I think that is probably something that's that I was born with, really. I mean, just have a natural innate curiosity, and that's and I followed that in my nose along the way. But to your point and to your question, I got into policing, and it was I think the purpose in my mind at the time, and I'll use this word. I don't know if it's some might take offense to it or object to it, but at the time, what conjured up in my mind is the purpose of policing. And the purpose of policing for me was to protect the weak from the strong. And when you're weak, you're vulnerable. And when you're vulnerable, you do desperate things. What I was really fortunate in my career was to be in an environment where I was mentored by some very progressive leaders. And a combination of that environment where you can fail and pick yourself up and keep going, have the humility to experiment with community members, but at the same time, allow that curiosity to question really what is being weak really mean, or what is strong? What is the strong forces out there that we're protecting ourselves against? And at various points in my career, it was built, and I observed that very often what we're protecting people against could actually be an addiction, could actually be underemployment, could actually be homelessness. Is that the root cause of some of what we see in the criminal justice system? And I say that in air quotes because I think words matter, and I'm not sure, to the points that Cal and Dale have made, that criminal justice system ought not to be renamed justice system. And we all know that it's not a system; it's a system of systems, as Sir Brian Levison pointed out, I believe, in his commission when he was looking at the Tottenham riots in the UK. So as this all starts to emerge and evolve in my world, where I was learning as much and continue to learn, which is why I really love being part of the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and in that school, the Global Justice Lab, where we are learning about what it really means at this intersection of policing or law enforcement and public health. But for, much like Dale and others, having also the advantage of being on the outside as much as on the inside, and back and forth. And I think that's a very important aspect to what we're talking about today and what we've been talking about for many years, which is, how do we, and you use the words defund and reimagined and rethink. I was very fortunate, much like Dale, having a career as a police chief and then moving into government as a deputy minister. And over a 4+ year period, rewriting the Police Services Act in Ontario. And the whole premise was not just community safety and well-being, but in fact, changing the demand, bending the cost curve by reducing the demand for services that we know are better provided elsewhere. And so this combination of having an inside out, outside in view and experience, being in an environment where I had the great fortune to learn from many big thinkers and great mentors, and the power of legislation, but also the courage of strong political advocates who wanted to make change in a way that was bold and courageous, and some would argue maybe even cost them a one-term government, but they did it because they knew it was right, which really brings us back to principles and values. So all of that, I think, is why we feel right now that we are at a point in time where I'll say once again we can make change, but it's going to take some courageous leadership.
Yeah, you know, your last little bit there really goes back to the timing point that both Cal and Dale made. And I think one of the questions is, well, we might see the opportunity, we might see this window. Is the leadership there? Are those senior political leaders alive to the reality as much as those that work in these professions? And I think this is one of the things that leaders need to understand, how they can have an effect on other leaders, and I've seen all of you do that. I also reminded in your earlier comments there, when you were talking about who are we protecting people from, we see logos on the side of police vehicles. Probably the most common, certainly across North America, is to serve and protect. I'm not sure I've ever seen a police cruiser go by that says to enforce laws and kick ass. That's not the mission. And yet, one might be confused. And certainly it's something that I think we have to challenge in the profession. What is the mission? And we'll talk more about that as we go. Hey, folks, this is the riskiest part for me as a moderator, because now I'm going to ask you for your comments. And we'd love to get some thoughts from you before we go into any more detail on what we've written and some of the ideas that we've put into this textbook. How do you react to some of the initial observations from the panelists? Does it agree with your own thinking? Is this just another session on leadership theory? Are these collaborations in LEPH and CSWB, are they indeed requiring new ways of doing business for leaders? Well, we might not get to everyone, or we might only get one person put their hand up, but let's hear from a few. I want to dedicate a few minutes to this and make sure that we get some interaction going here. So let me see some hands, and let's hear your comments. What do you think about changing patterns and changing trends, or the requirement for those in policing and across the LEPH community? Dick, I'm not sure I can see the hands on my panel here, so I'm just gonna have to count on somebody.
No, I'll keep an eye on that, and I'll if somebody puts their hand up, I can admit them and let them speak.
Well, I learned long ago that when you ask people to actually get involved, you wait, and I'm going to wait, and that makes people uncomfortable because they're sitting there going, "I want to say something, but I don't want to," so I'm going to wait. Let's give you a few seconds. Let's get some hands on the screen.
Well, I can jump in and start. And I was intrigued by Dale's comments about the idea of combining policing and health into a single ministry, and what he described as the front end and the back end. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? I think that's really quite novel, but it makes a lot of sense just intuitively.
Yeah, and just so you know, there's a question in the chat. I've got two screens open here, but just on that, Dick, so if you think about this and you actually start to look at things differently, and think about law enforcement, public health, because I think this is really where it came together for me. Public health has the ability to engineer a solution. Law enforcement have the ability to reverse engineer a system. So you've got two ends of the spectrum. Police control 100% of intake in the justice system, and public health is the best deterrent for intake into the emergency rooms of the hospital. If you actually can get the front end and the back end working collectively together, you basically should be able to shrink the middle being social services, by a significant portion overnight. I happen to have this file in government. We did lots of case studies, people that were in and out of jail less than 6 months at a time, and what were the two things that they had to keep them out of jail for over a year at a time. And it was a job and a relationship. Well, we intuitively know that. We intuitively know what the social determinants of health are, and we also intuitively know that the social determinants of health are the same as the social determinants of justice. If you look at public health, and having served on a health board for a few years by appointment of the premier in a previous province, is public health was the money that was invested in the front end of the system, which was often not spent because that was needed in the back end of the system to actually run your emergency rooms and your triage, and not stemming the flow into the system. If we don't stem the flow into the system, we never will be successful. So when you do the analytics on this, there's only two things that matter: reducing intake, and you heard Matt and Cal and Norm mention, that's demand reduction. We need to reduce intake. But the other thing is all those off ramps that are out of the system, that could be child welfare, bail remand, mental health, addictions, housing, homeless, the list goes on. All we're really measuring is what we take into the system, but nobody's actually measuring how many people we get out into success. If we can actually flip that metrics on its head and do the right combination of things, I think we actually can take 20% of the system out of the system in a very short period of time. And I'll give you an example, and then I'll be quiet. The police budget in the city of Edmonton is roughly $462 million. This is the city of Edmonton. The spend on the social safety net for the city of Edmonton is $7.5 billion. 7.5 billion. We're a little bit more than 6%. If you add EMS and you add fire, it's about 11%. The reality is now that I've been in government, like Matt said, I actually know how to find the money. We hired somebody to actually look at it. It's all public documents, but nobody's looking at the system. Everybody's looking at a portion of the system that impacts them. When you actually can start to design a better system to deal with this, this isn't quite as hard as we think it is. It's hard to solve globally. We can't end it overnight, but it's not as hard when we chunk it out and take those 3 or 4 things that are disproportionately driving calls for service across the spectrum, and then we can make 1 + 1 = 3. So we've done a lot of work on this in my old job, and we're doing a lot of work in my new job. And I've got a group of police chiefs that I see now, I call it a consortium of the willing, that we need to start leveraging each other to figure out how we tell this story better. Because the story and what we're trying to solve is only based on the limited information that we have. And that's part of our problem.
That's good. And I think that's important that the police chiefs start telling their story, as you said. There's a question in the Q&A that I'll just read out, and it is, what about changing the idea of law enforcement and public health from what one does to how one makes others feel?
Yeah, I like that question a lot, Dick. I'm gonna let's go to that one, then we'll go to Paul, and I also want to get to Sonia's that she's put up in the chat because it's a pretty important one too. So our anonymous attendee, that's a great question. It flows right out of what Dale was just talking about, and I like the evident compassion that underlies that question. Personally, you've already heard me take my shot at the term law enforcement. I'm not a fan. But I like this idea of getting away from even the siloed labels, and let's talk about how we're helping. How are we helping people meet their fundamental aspirations? How are we helping people live in a society that is equitable? How do we move in that direction? Cal, your thoughts? Can we?
Well, I think, it's a tremendous outcome that we should all be striving for, right? As opposed to some of the outputs of policing and broader community safety. Isn't the goal really about making people feel safe and secure? And at another level, I think of Dr. John Helliwell out of University of British Columbia, who heads up the Global Happiness Report, and some of the work that he does, and Charles Montgomery and others. In fact, you're seeing countries like I'm trying to think. There's the economics of happiness, for example, is now an area of study. Dubai. And, there's a few countries now that have put a lot of emphasis on quote unquote happiness, or how people feel. ultimately, that's got to be one of our primary objectives. It's a really good point.
Fantastic. Hey, Paul, I want to ask your patience. I'm going to come to your question in a minute because it's going to lead us more into the some of the content that we're going to go to next. But I definitely want to go to Sonia, who's put a really important observation on the chat. And Sonia, thank you for doing that. Let me be the first to use the word racism and apologize that we're a half an hour in and it's the first time you've heard it. It is absolutely something we're alive to. As far as the fact that we're 4 white males doing this, that just happens to be who we are and the work that we've done. But I will tell you that in a few minutes, we're going to talk about some case studies. We didn't want to write chapters about our own experience. We wanted to write chapters about emerging exemplars who are demonstrating new leadership capabilities. And I can tell you there is more diversity in those case studies that we're going to talk about. But to your point, I think you heard some of the panelists talk about this being a unique window of opportunity, and let's be crystal clear that it's the refocus, the reestablishment, the reigniting, I think, of our awareness of colonial and systemic racism that sits front and center. In my mind, even more so than the pandemic, is how I will remember 2020. And, you know, we're doing a lot of work right now in introducing collaborative methods to communities. But my colleagues and I actually reached a point where we said, unless they're willing to talk about the racism and the underlying colonial relics, then we really don't want to help them with clever, tricky models. We have to have the fundamental level of conversation that you're raising. And I think that's really important. Matt, let me invite you to jump in on that. Or Dale, you want to grab it?
Well, first of all, Norm, you know, I appreciate and respect that comment, but I'm also Métis, which is Indigenous, so I take a bit of exception to that. My police service was the first to step out in front in relation to say racism does exist, but racism exists in every factor of what we do. It's also a priority for the Edmonton Police Service to increase its diversity, and we've done a lot of things in relation to do that. But I want to be very clear, diversity is not just race or gender, but it's also thinking and experiences. So we're well on our way. I appreciate those comments, but I think that's an overgeneralization to think that there's not diversity in this panel, and there's others that I know have diversity as well. I don't base my comments on that. I base my comments on what I've learned by traveling across the world and speaking to many, many diverse populations and taking the sum of the parts and adding them all up. So I appreciate the comment, and I'm respectful of the comment, but I want to be very clear when we start making comments like that and overgeneralizing, we should know exactly what we're talking about before we do that out of respect.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here as well, Norm. I very much respect the question, and thank you for raising it, because it is important. So just a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I'm not one of those that will say we are at a unique moment in time or in history and we need to make change now or lose the opportunity. And the reason why I say that is because you have to, you know, go back to in Ontario anyway. In the 1980s, late 1980s, there was a race relations task force on policing because of the overrepresentation, the use of force that police were exerting on racialized communities, and in particular young Black men in Ontario. The government of the day formed a task force. 2, 3, 4 years later, they formed another task force because the problem wasn't changing. We had report after report. We saw racial profiling rear its ugly head. We saw carding in Ontario rear its ugly head. We see examples of police leaders of the day become entrenched and defensive in their position to, instead of embracing and wanting to make change, they decide they're going to argue against the methodology used to raise the awareness that was being raised by the communities. I mean, the question is, and you know, and it's a question because I don't know if any of us have the answers. I can cynically have an answer, but there are many opportunities over the last number of years to address what the most recent Black Lives Matter protests are about, and the outrage and in communities around the world, for that matter, when we take a look at the use of force by police and the use of deadly force. And like Dale, I mean, we are who we are. I am also, I grew up in a home where English was not the only language spoken. I'm the grandson of genocide survivors and witnessed firsthand in our family what intergenerational trauma can bring about in a different context. So, to Dale's point, we're bringing in those experiences as well. But I think your point is on the mark, in the sense that we, over time, and we look back, we can see that policing was not an environment that we would have said was safe for women or racialized people. And today's resistance to even utter the words systemic racism by some police leaders is problematic, for sure.
So Matt, I'm going to pick up on that because I like the practical spin that Jennifer has put on it with her post to the Q&A. And thanks for that, Jennifer, because it gets to this issue. And maybe I'll call you on what both Dale and Matt just said, and I'll raise you this question. We still have a system that has a very predictable career path in it, a very predictable normative lens. How do you let people in, Jennifer asks? How do you get people in a law enforcement or policing agencies? Are we there yet? Cal, I know you've talked a lot about this. Are we actually to a point where we could say that the next candidate for deputy chief or deputy commissioner is not someone who spent their first 5 years writing tickets, is not someone who is a walking symbol of the decades of police tradition? Can we get there, Cal?
Yeah, I think one of the first things that comes to mind to me is the increasing and long overdue increased number of women in senior levels of police services here in Canada. I mean, I look at my former organization, and the majority of the senior leaders in each of our provinces, the majority of them now are women. And I think as you develop a greater diversity in all its forms, as others on the panel have mentioned, around that executive table, so too are going to change the types of decisions, moving this away from a police leadership culture that is more inward focused to one that's very much outward focused, and that'll come, and it's coming finally, long overdue, but it's coming.
Fantastic. Paul, thanks for your patience. I want to come to your question, share it with the room. To what extent does what appears to be an increasingly polarized public impact collaborative leadership? And that's going to lead us into some of the content stuff that we want to talk about in a couple of minutes here. But yes, it's an increasingly polarized public, and I'm going to make my own observations here. What I've been a little disturbed to see over the past several months since things really flared up is how, well, we might have a polarity. We also have, and I think Matt used this word, a very defensive response, a very defensive reflex response from within the policing sector. We've had some police leaders with the courage and humility to come out and say, yes, we're listening. Yes, we're aware. We've had an awful lot across the country who just say, no, that's not us. That's not who we are. And as anybody who's ever done mediation will tell you, that's not how you get to yes. That's not how you're going to get to an agreement, by locking in on your position. So I think the first thing we need to do is get off that positional leg, and we have to start talking about listening, storytelling, actually hearing the lived experience of people, not just going into our own little clusters and saying, here's what we think they're saying, let's tell them why they're wrong. And I think that's a huge point that we need to move to. Our anonymous attendee who posted a question here, how do you navigate change in the stronghold of policing unions? I'm going to ask you to hold that thought to our later ending segment when we talk about the path forward, because I think that's a very interesting challenge. And I know that my colleagues will have words to say about that. So let me, at this point, I'm going to go back to sharing the screen for a minute, if you'll indulge me with that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we were thinking, and how we're going to apply these things. So, after lots and lots of discussion about these changes, and you're hearing the panelists all talk about them, we settled in on 3 distinctive characteristics And I think we've already heard traces of all three of them in this discussion so far. First is what's different, if we're looking at what's different about the leaders of the future and the ones who've emerged recently, is leaders with the courage and passion to expand the mission. I think Matt specifically talked about that a few minutes ago when he talked about what is the mission and where are we really trying to go. And certainly Dale, in his sort of radical notions, as some people would characterize them, of moving policing out of justice and into public health, something that was very familiar with his thinking on that a couple of years ago. The second is leaders who are able to shift their focus from positional power to multi-sector influence. In many ways, that's the toughest one, because having been around leadership development and policing for about 3 decades now, the conditioning towards a positional power model is just so evident and continues to be evident in selection panels and interviews and preparatory work, etc. We talk in a lot of meeting rooms and a lot of conferences about a different style of policing, and yet when it comes to selecting and promoting, there is a linear path that still tends.
Right, we lost Norm there for a second. We'll wait till he catches up to us a bit. One of the other panelists want to jump in while he's lagged?
I can take a shot at where he was going there, Dick. I think part of that is, you know, if you're in a position of police chief or you're in a position of leadership, leadership is leadership. And to his point, in relation to those things, it's doing the things that aren't popular. It's actually coming in with a mandate to work yourself out of a job. You know, certainly that's my approach in relation to this space. I think it ties into some of the other questions is, what are you doing in the environment that you can control to make the changes that are needed to do? The interesting part that ties into one of the questions, I think it was Paul that said in relation to the public and the concerns coming from the public, and then the other question, just how that all ties together and how do you actually change it, and even ties into the unions. I think what we actually go back to is data led right now, and the ability to use that data to get some partnerships. For instance, for us right now, some of the biggest growth that we're seeing in relation to calls for service are the fact that domestic violence. Well, domestic violence, as we all know, happens behind closed doors, which means that if we're going to have an impact on that, we have to have the right partners. We need to actually spend time as police leaders and as leaders of the public sector, getting underneath those community agencies that actually can drive those results, sharing our data, actually getting the supports to build some of the supports that they actually need to drive the change, and getting underneath them. Because when we form true partnerships, and I want to differentiate, a partnership is different than collaborating. Collaborating is usually people at a table till it talks about somebody's budget and then, oh, wait a minute, I'm out. Partnerships is where you have to win together and you lose together. And I think using that voice of influence, that's the biggest opportunity for a police leader right now to take that influential position to do some of that. That's certainly our focus. But it also means that we won't be partnering with everybody anymore. We need to partner with those people that are willing to share their data, take our lumps and our wins together, and at the end of the day, how we get underneath them. So I think we're never been in a better position based on the environment that we're in to do some of the things as Norm was articulating there. I see he's back on now, so I will be quiet.
Well, thanks for recovering there. My home internet just decided, I don't, maybe the cable guys are down the road digging up something, but all of a sudden it went. So I switched to plan B with the hotspot connection. Hopefully I don't drop out again. I was in the middle of a sentence there, and I don't know if that came through, but what I was getting at was the whole issue of the stresses and mental health challenges that our members are facing. And if ever there was a time where we need police leaders that aren't about, hey, you serve me, but how can I better make life for you? That's a huge challenge, I think, that we need to see more of, compassionate leadership, servant leadership, et cetera, et cetera. So where I was going with that was to share this image with you here. Give me a second. Hopefully it still works. Hopefully you're seeing that. So I was talking about the three distinctive characteristics, but I want to introduce you to the folks that we put into our case studies. The organizers of the Springer collection really encouraged us to focus on some case studies. And as I mentioned, we didn't want to see a chapter that was talking about the experience of the four of us. We wanted to look at, is there evidence? What led us to the conclusion that these are in fact distinctive characteristics and that they do in fact exist? And so I'm really pleased to introduce to you, at least virtually here, the folks that we focused in on in what we called profiles in distinctive leadership. And we selected each of them because of the ways in which they had impressed us on the one hand, and the ways in which we thought that they really did demonstrate some very particular strengths. Right out of the gate, of course, Team Scotland. Many of you will be familiar with John and Karen. If you were at Edinburgh, you may have met. We had the pleasure of meeting them first 10 years ago in Scotland, and then subsequently on their trips to Canada and at various conferences. These two individuals revolutionized the approach to violence reduction in Scotland, of course, alongside many other people, and they'd be the first to tell you. But, we had the pleasure of talking with them back in the summer as we were preparing the chapter. And again, it just rang so true to the question that was asked a few minutes ago. How do you make change in an environment of polarity? How do you make change in tough times? I remember John saying, you just keep going at it. And Karen telling us, you just don't give up. You expect that you're going to be pushed back, and you just don't give up. And here they are 15 years after they first formed the duo and began working on that violence reduction unit, and they're still making change. And so we talk about them in the chapter. In Chelsea, Massachusetts, we had the opportunity to work with Molly Baldwin at Oroka and the tremendous work there. Molly introduced us to the folks at the Chelsea Police Department and ultimately to the community of Chelsea. And two members of the Chelsea Police, not just because of what they did in Chelsea, but as pioneers, the first in the US to adopt some of the work that we were doing in Canada. They have gone on to be ambassadors for this work. And I know from talking to them, the challenge of talking to dyed-in-the-wool cops and police leaders in the US policing culture, they've had a real challenge getting folks to recognize there are other ways. There are ways to get there. And they've been talking rethink and reimagine for the last 5 years. Focus Rexdale was the first application of the work that we had done in Saskatchewan on the Prince Albert Hub, first one outside of the province. Today, Focus has over 130 agencies working in collaboration, and 8 different divisions of the Toronto Police are engaged in frontline collaboration. 3 individuals that we really looked at. And this makes a strong point that we didn't only want to focus on leadership as a titled position or a hierarchical position, because in their roles as the coordinators of Focus, Greg, Donovan, and Brian all approached it from a mid-command level. I think at the time, Greg was a sergeant. He's a superintendent now. Donovan was a sergeant. Brian's a detective. And they have been steadfastly driving forward changes in thinking, and they've brought literally thousands of their colleagues in the Toronto Police towards a different way of thinking about meeting the needs of communities, and particularly marginalized and communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, the gay community, etc. The last 2 really are stand out for their tremendous work in intimate partner violence and moving on to sexual violence in partnership with the University of New Brunswick and their work with the Canadian Association of Chiefs and Police. Kimberly and Leanne, 2 exemplary police chiefs in Canada, and we showcase some of their work. The common denominators in these individuals, among all of their strengths and characteristics, for us, the most important common denominators is that they were literally living and breathing examples of these distinctive characteristics that we talked about. The courage and passion to change the mission. John and Karen said, we have to ask ourselves, are we doing this right? You know, Scotland was seeing horrendous data and horrendous outcomes over a period of many years. And they went to all of their various colleagues in very informal ways. They sat in meeting after meeting after meeting, and they said to people, we need to change the mission. We need to get at this differently. Shifting the focus from power to multi-sector influence. And I think the focus coordinators and Dave and Dan out of Chelsea, perfect examples of saying, I'm not asking you to do this because I'm the boss. I'm offering you a different way of looking at it. And let me help bring that along. And for Leanne and Kimberly, I think one of their greatest challenges as two among very few high-profile women leaders in Canadian policing was to help guide and support others in understanding that the way we were doing it wasn't necessarily right, and to bring that humility about. So we, in our chapter, we spend a lot of time looking at these characteristics, but we also focus on these individual profiles as a way to bring it to life. And we really would encourage you to look for that when it comes out. My understanding is the book's coming out sometime soon. That's a hard date, sometime soon. So mark that down. But let's go into them. Matt, you know Leanne and Kimberly quite well. Which of our three characteristics stand out for you as you reflect on them as distinctive leaders? Again, back to this point of some of the unique window, the collaborative times that we're in. And this goes to Paul's earlier question about, you know, how do you achieve collaboration in tough times? What are your thoughts, Matt? Go ahead.
Yeah, you're right. I very fortunate to know both Kimberly and Leanne quite well, and for many, many years from different perspectives and different seats, both as the chief and as a deputy minister. And in particular, recently, as they were bringing forward the work that you just referenced. And, you know, I'd have to say they are a great dynamic pair of police leaders who together, I think, have both the courage and passion to, as you describe, expand the mission. And Leanne is a strong force in that regard. And Kimberly is, you know, the quintessential partner, multi-sector, not positional, wants to work in collaboration with others. And I think the fact that the both of them have worked together to forward a very important part of police response and the manner in which it's led, I think speaks to their leadership, but also to who they are as individuals. And I think you nail it with bringing both of those police leaders into the light, because they, to me, they epitomize those first 2 points that you mentioned around expanding the mission and shifting from positional power, positional influence to one of multi-sectoral influence.
Well, that's great. Thank you. And, you know, Amanda, you asked a question about, are there any true partnerships? Are there shared funding models with shared goals? And certainly the work that Leanne and Kimberly led and we're now seeing. I don't know if Paul, Dick, can we get any members to speak, or are we restricted in terms of who can comment? I don't know if Paul's ready to be put on the spot.
Yeah, anyone who wants to speak, yeah, they can stick their hand up now. If Paul wants to speak, he can stick his hand up now. You know, allow him to talk just from my control panel here. And while he's thinking about that, I'm just going to make a comment about somebody mentioned about mental health of police and first responders. That has been one of the themes of the law enforcement public health conferences for the last number of conferences, and it remains one of the major themes. There was an excellent session on March 15th. If anyone wants to look at the recording of that, on March 15th, just go to the Whova app and you can see what the police leaders are talking about with respect to mental health of their members. And there's another session, I think, on Wednesday coming up about that same thing. So I'm going to find Paul here if he's stuck his hand up. Maybe he's hiding.
Not to put you on the spot, Paul, and if you'd rather not, I can comment, but on this question about shared funding and shared goals and true partnership, I couldn't help but think of the work that you've been doing in Sudbury with the Indigenous community, and some of the recent work that you've done in with regards to the response to Indigenous women's issues. So I was going to give you a chance to comment, but in the meantime, let me move on. I see Dale wants to comment as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, Norman, knowing Paul's as well, yes, there are some examples. I can give you some, like, for instance, as Richard just mentioned, we have PAC teams, police and crisis teams that have joint goals and outcomes. We're going to 24/7 PAC. We've hired 10 social workers that work in our new help model, which is very similar to the Cahoots. It's probably a second iteration of the Cahoots model from Eugene, Oregon. So we're getting more and more of these right now. They're data driven, they're based on outcomes. And actually, we're actually funding those social workers through our budget to a third party provider. So I do think there's lots of more examples. There's others that exist in Canada. Paul can give you some examples. PACT, the police in crisis, there's lots of. The next one, the OPP has the Ontario Provincial Police. They are actually putting mental health workers in dispatch centers to triage that first call. We're actually looking at that in Edmonton right now, including trying to build a joint dispatch center with the various partners to ensure that we're getting that first call and sending the right response from first opportunity. So lots of that going on in Canada, and I think a lot more to come.
Yeah, and Amanda, I'll just add with respect to your question around funding, I'd also point out that in many cases, some of the most effective true partnerships don't require funding. They simply require a change in behavior. Obviously, the situation table model that a lot of us have been associated with is a perfect example where we now have well over 150 communities across Canada and the US that are operating collaborative risk intervention tables with no new funding required. It merely come together once a week and do your job a little differently. And one of the things that we stress, and by the way, tomorrow afternoon with some other colleagues, we'll be talking about the learning models that are available for introducing situation tables. But what we stress is that if you don't have the senior leaders involved, if they're not prepared to embrace a collaborative world, then you're going to really struggle. And Dale, this brings me to the question I was going to ask you, maybe to take us in the next direction. I remember you and I being just truly inspired by our first conversations with John and Karen in Scotland, and all the other times that we worked with them. What's different about them in your view? And how did those differences help Scotland and others get down the path of community safety and well-being collaboratives? And are there others that you describe in similar terms?
Yeah, you know, it's a good point, and Norm, knowing all the people that you talked about in the chapter, I know them all, and I think there's some similarities. But the thing I think that caught, and I mean, you were there as well, but they were willing to stand up before standing up was cool. These were the cool kids before cool was cool, and I mean, I use that as an overgeneralization, but they were strongly grounded in data. They were strongly grounded in what works, and they were willing to put their reputations, and that's that whole thing. Leadership, you know, is not it's not a role, it's a responsibility, and they were willing to put their reputation because what they knew based on what they were working on, that they were getting outcomes and that could be measured. And I think when we went there, and you know, now knowing both of them fairly well, when we came back and took hubs to Saskatchewan at the time, it was John that kept saying, well, we need to go back and see you guys because you guys have leveraged us. Just like in community safety and well-being, when we implemented the hubs in the community safety well-being in Saskatchewan, Ontario through Matt took that a step up. And I think the point there here is real leaders are willing to showcase their stuff and let somebody build it out further than they could, and then steal and beg and borrow back and build it out again and go in another direction so we can add on to it. And that's what's fundamentally missing. I don't really care, as everybody else that I know on this panel, whose idea it is. I care that we get some better outcomes for the people that we actually are serving. And right now, that's what stood out for me from John and Karen. And they came at it from two perspectives. Karen was a health background, John was a cop. But when they talked, John could take Karen's slides and Karen could take John's slides. And that's when you get success, is when you actually understand how the other side of the equation works. And as a result, they become pretty dynamic. And the only thing that I'd add to that is what we got to be careful of is way before them and what we're doing now, we got to stop managing change with how many likes you get on Twitter. That's part of the distraction right now. And the reality is when it's grounded in evidence and you're willing to stake your reputation and stand up for it because that's what the community needs, to me, that's the leadership both of them had.
Great observation. Cal, this goes right to the point that I was going to raise with you. And I think of how often you and I have found ourselves talking about the notion of the courage to change the mission of policing. And that's precisely what Dale was just talking about. In many ways, it's what both the Focus and Chelsea teams have done, and we're seeing in a lot of other jurisdictions. Why is it so vital to our future? And what's it going to take to find the courage and apply it, that we don't just rely on similar reflexes? One of the fundamental or characteristics, I'm not going to say problem, but one of the fundamental characteristics of policing succession is that by the time people have the real clout and influence necessary, they're in their last 3 years of their career, and many of them choose that likes on Twitter model that Dale just described instead of stand up and make a difference because maybe it's too much trouble. How do we change that? How do we get the people? And can you talk about some folks that you're seeing who have the courage to challenge that mission and go in different directions? Thoughts?
Well, I think, Norm, you started the discussion today off with, conversations that the four of us have had. And, we think about, and the police leaders across our countries are tremendous leaders in their own right. But when you think about those that are able to go beyond policing today, providing excellence in policing today, those that are looking to the future, that are respectful of the past, respectful of the traditions of policing and everything else, but have got that courage, they're forward thinking, innovative, results oriented, comfortable with ambiguity. This is a huge one, and that flourish in that integrated multidisciplinary setting. Now you're starting to differentiate kind of the wheat from the chaff in essence. So the challenge, a key challenge we've got is building that critical mass. And work and discussions with a number of our police academies and colleges in Canada. Everybody's today looking at their leadership development models, but very few are really taking stock of, to pick up on Dale's analogy earlier, where's the puck going to be, and making that play towards that. So the skill sets that are required in this future environment that these 8 or 9 leaders that we profiled in the case studies, those skill sets that we've touched on in various respects today, those have not been required largely in the past, nor have they been typically developed. So what does the future require? It requires, from a police perspective, fundamentally rethinking not just how, but what we're developing our police leaders to do. Today, I'd argue we're developing very, very well to lead today's organization, but today is tomorrow. So we've already lost opportunity. We've really got to double those efforts. And the key with this is it doesn't have to cost a lot. We don't need to send everybody off for an MBA. Some people will do very well with that. A lot of what can be done very inexpensively. And it starts with get them reading, because we don't tend to be a culture of readers in the main. Get them reading. Second is, how do you use in situ or on the job the learning that can happen every day, and with just a little bit of extra effort, turn that learning into organizational learning. So there's a lot of things can be done that we don't spend very finite resources on sending people away on courses. We use that sort of 10% on that to accelerate the learning and to amplify the learning that could take place otherwise. But the cheapest thing we do, get them reading.
So can I jump in here with a
Please do. Yeah.
perfect segue? We did not set this up, but that's a perfect, shameless plug. Absolutely right. I want to say a few things. First, leadership comes in different forms. And it doesn't always need to be, even though our chapter speaks specifically because of our experiences on police leadership and leveraging police leadership, there are, to Dale's point and some of the comments earlier, there are other partners external to policing that are leaders. And the four of us, as we know, are very involved in the Journal of Community Safety and Wellbeing. To Cal's point about reading and research and that strategic foresight that you're talking about, because this is a great vehicle to look at research, peer-reviewed, scholarly, open access information that can get us thinking when we're reading and pointing ourselves into a particular direction. And this is critical, because what we know today is that we are, as you're seeing police organizations evolve and develop, we're bringing people into policing today that asking them to Cal's point, asking them to do something today, knowing that in 15 years or so, we're going to be asking them to do something that none of us have even thought of yet. How are we developing? And one of the points, or one of the comments by Paul Rinkoff from Toronto Police Service, who's listening in and has done work. As a matter of fact, here's your plug, Paul. I mean, Paul's got a great original research piece in the journal in this issue on leadership development. And these are the types of thought leadership opportunities that we know and that we can see. And in particular, here we have Niche Technology, who, full disclosure, I am involved in as a strategic advisor, but they support this journal because they know as well that information at the core of what they do is key to evaluating and measuring the outcomes for communities, and in fact, creating greater impacts, as Dale was talking about. So the leadership comes from different places. We've got some vehicles like the journal. We've got these forums, this conference, which is fabulous, and there are many others. And I just wanted to emphasize Cal's point about reading, learning, strategic foresight, strategic development, and some of the great work like Paul Rinkoff and others that have contributed.
I'm going to go to Dale.
Sorry.
Just a quick reminder to everybody online that there is the chat function as well as the Q&A. And as we head into our final minutes together, any questions, please get them on the board. Dale, I know you've got some thoughts on this.
Yeah, Norm, I don't want to repeat what Cal and Matt said, because I totally agree, but I want to talk about the next piece that we have to work on collectively together. And that's why finding a consortium willing for me, some police chiefs, some other leaders to talk about. But what we got to build, there's pockets of excellence across the world. And, I've been one of those people, like some on the line here and some that are probably in the chat that have been able to go and see. We really need an ecosystem for change, though, so we actually can look at this differently. And in the middle of that ecosystem, we did a lot of work on this, and we're doing a whole bunch more in our Community Solutions Accelerator. It's got data in the center. Take a little bit of what the UK has done, and it has a center of excellence, what works center, co-design, co-measurement, co-evaluation up front. Part of that is an innovation lab. Then it has to have a deal flow or a third party for independent evaluation that actually takes the politics, gives the politics an immune system. You need a funding body that's separate from government for the ability to do innovation. And then really what it is, you plug the problem in, and you will align all the service providers to actually attack the problem in a collective group, and they will have to merge and amalgamate to do that. And those service providers really come in three forms: government bodies, they come in not-for-profits or CBOs, and they come in the universities. And we have never put an ecosystem to get all these strengths that we have going in the same direction. So I always get asked the question, it's like playing a game of Risk. What happens when you put an army on every country? We all know the answer is you're first out of the game. We need to start aligning our armies through an ecosystem to tackle problems that are actually relevant to what's happening right now. And if we could get those 3, 4, 5 problems, everything we've talked about here today, when we talk about the vulnerable, we talk about harm reduction, we're talking about trauma. We're talking about mental health and addictions, overrepresented by domestic violence. We all know there's a housing piece and jobs and employment and education in that, but we're not linking these together because we have no ecosystem to do it. So beyond our traditional role of developing the leader, we also have to collectively drive that ecosystem for success while we're doing that.
All right, good. Dick, I see you're saying there's one last question. Can you read it in for us?
Yes, it's how do you navigate change to a public health model in the stronghold of policing unions?
Yes, thank you for bringing that one
towards
back.
law and order. Yeah.
Yeah, and thanks for patience on whoever posted that. It is a good way to head into our final minutes here as we look ahead. Lots of good ideas and lots of exemplars out there that we can draw upon. And we hope that our chapter contributes to the beginning of a conversation and not the end of it. But let's look at some of those challenges, because one of the challenges, as I mentioned earlier, is we have a system that celebrates hierarchical authority in just about every part of its trappings. And we're asking people to deal in a way where the most important customer isn't just your boss, and turn that pyramid the other way. That's one. Another that this individual has raised is police associations who, many of whom I work with on a regular basis, and some very progressive leaders in the associations who know we need to see difference, but they've got a day job too. They've got members to protect. They've got current collective bargaining rights to protect. Can we move towards that 15-year horizon that you've all talked about? Interestingly, by the way, the Canadian Chiefs of Police is about to conclude its very first cohort of strategic foresight. And the target year of the work that those mid-level people have done in that learning program is 2035. And when you look at the work they've developed, you suddenly discover that's not as far away as an old guy like me might think. How do we get there? Can we retool? Can we get ourselves moving faster between now and 2035 than, for example, we may have done between now and 2005? Which is about the same distance looking backward. And we all remember how familiar that is. Some thoughts on that, guys? People on the panel?
Well, maybe I'll kick it off. And at one time, I played a role between the commissioner's office and the elected representatives of the membership in the RCMP. And between that and other reflections on this issue, it's an excellent question looking forward, and the impact of CBAs and the associations. And I think if we took a scan of police leadership over the last 20 or 25 years, the associations are a reflection of the quality of that leadership and the relation. And by that, I mean the quality of the leadership vis-a-vis the relationship that had been developed with the membership, how the membership had been treated is reflected in today's CBAs. So I'm not talking at all about today's cadre of senior police leaders, but rather a snapshot over many years. We look to the US where, there have been cases in the States where to bring about change in policing, they pretty much had to fold some police agencies and start them from the ground up to get around some of these issues. I'd agree with you, Norm. I think in the Canadian context, we're very fortunate to have the quality of leaders on the association side. Tom Stamatakis, leading the Canadian Police Association, has just been an outstanding leader in that regard, and relations are generally good. But making these moves will require, again, today's leaders to really be thinking of what it is by way of a shared vision for the future, and that's systematically working with and bringing on board all of the stakeholders, including the associations, so that they see, this isn't this flash in the pan, the flavor of the month. This is a long-term committed effort to bring about some fundamental changes to this. The bottom line, as I mentioned at the outset, we can't afford to do otherwise. there simply isn't going to be the money to continue it alone. And we already know that we're dealing with complex adaptive problems in society. Police are only dealing with one aspect of that. We need that multidisciplinary lens brought to all of these.
Excellent. Matt, you, in your time in government, you and your colleagues introduced some of the most challenging changes to the Police Act in a generation. And I know it wasn't always easy. You were much taller with a full head of hair, I think, when you started. What are your reflections? What are the biggest challenges in being able to bring about change, and not just with the associations and CBAs, but with our partnerships with other ministries, and with community-based organizations, and with many of the justifiably aggrieved communities that have lost trust, and that makes it difficult to even begin to collaborate. What are your thoughts?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I referenced it a little bit at the beginning. Norm, you're absolutely right. I mean, the changes that we introduced, we thought, and I certainly was pushing for concretizing this change in law, because it's been mentioned, and we know from the past that if it's left at the will of those willing, then we're not going to get as far as we need to get, and we're not going to get there at all in some cases, because, and we watched and witnessed this even when we were developing the act, there were still that territorial leadership that was resident in all of the different groups. I won't even name them. They all had it. And to the government of the day's credit, listen, as a person who is, thinking more on the reform side and the progressive side, it wasn't as far as I would have liked to have seen. And I pushed for some changes, but on the other side of things, it went a lot further than perhaps most would have thought any elected group of officials would have been willing to push. And so when we saw that community safety and well-being was actually now community safety and well-being planning, it's going to be mandated to each one of the 444 municipalities in Ontario. And this was a huge initiative. That was big, and that still is. And we also know that the governance and oversight for policing is a critical factor, and building up that the governors and ensuring that they have the right training, the right education, to points that have been made earlier. And also the selection criteria is important, as are those that are coming into the organization and policing to begin with. So, I mean, and go on, but what we saw was an awful lot of entrenchment, and that authentic leadership inside government actually won the day.
Thanks, Dale. I know you could offer a lot of similar observations. We're out of time. 30 seconds. Come a long way to hear Matt talking about how community safety and well-being planning has become enshrined. The language has clearly become enshrined across Canada. And when you think about where we were in a bar in Scotland 10 years ago last month, thinking, is Canada ready for some of these ideas? Quick reflections?
Yeah, hey, Norm, just before I offer that, there's 3 or 4 questions on the WOVA app. And I don't know if we can find a way to respond. There's some good questions on there. But just in relation to, is Canada ready for that? I think we're ready in pockets. We're absolutely willing to build the consortium of the willing. I see it as a growing momentum. You've got Paul Pedersen on the line. Paul and I, among 4 other chiefs, are talking on a regular basis. I think we have the ability to leverage some of the momentum. Plus, I think we have the right opportunity based on timing to actually do some of this stuff. And it's going to be important that we leverage each other to get it done, and that we're sitting around studying what we're going to do. We need to have action. I've been involved in more missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls inquiries. We've had all the racial discrimination inquiries. We've had inquiry after inquiry after inquiry. 75 recommendations, 100 recommendations, 35 recommendations. It's time to do some things to gain momentum and confidence. And that means we might fail a couple times. But if you actually flip that on its head and say failure is what we have, I think we're in the perfect opportunity to get some things done, and it's go time. And from the Edmonton Police Service, it's go time. And, you know, I've got great partners in our association here. You know, we disagree. Absolutely, we disagree. But at the end of the day, we can write our script or have our script written, and it's important that we're going in the same direction. So I think more than anything, it's timing.
I think this theme that you just hit on again right from the beginning, two things: the opportunity and the courage to stand up, and to be willing to look at it differently. Folks, we can't get to every question, and if there's some on the app, we'll take a look at them and possibly try to respond. I want to thank the panelists for their tremendous energy over the last hour and a half. I want to thank Dick and the organizers, and Jennifer for supporting us in this, the first time we've done it. I feel like I'm like one of those shows where they're doing like a movie trailer, because we're launching this chapter, and it's going to be kind of fun to see it in print. Watch for it. And thanks, Matt, for drawing out the journal. Make sure folks are aware. We're looking at some tremendous contributions coming in from the LAPH community, and that work continues. On my behalf, thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to further dialogue on all of this. Good luck with the rest of the conference. Thank you all.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks.
Excellent conference or panel. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dick.